So this podcast is going to go over the transport system that you know probably as the circulatory system or um, as the cardiovascular system. So I'm going to go and get started. I just pulled the drawing that I did from the other podcast on the drawings that you need to know for this unit over to this diagram so that I can use that to talk about some of the things. So 6.2.1 is the draw and label diagram of the heart. That's here. I showed you how to do it in the drawings podcast, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But 6.2.2 is about stating that the coronary artery supplies the heart muscle with oxygen and nutrients. So if we're looking at this diagram, we see that this is the left ventricle, and when the left ventricle closes, it pushes the blood into the aorta, and the aorta splits in three different directions, and one of those actually wrap back around to supply blood and the nutrients in blood back to the heart. Remember, the heart is a muscle, so it needs ATP or an energy molecule in order to contract and continuously pump blood around the body. So it needs to fuel itself with the same stuff that it's trying to fuel the rest of the body with. So the blood is going to bring back oxygen from the pulmonary, from the lungs, from the pulmonary vein to the left atrium to the left ventricle, through the aorta back to the heart. It's also going to use glucose that it got from the villi of the small intestine so that the glucose and the oxygen can be used to make ATP for the heart to pump. If the coronary artery gets blocked, one has a heart attack. And so that's what you need to understand. Next, you need to be able to explain the actions of the heart in terms of collecting blood, pumping blood, and opening and closing valves. So, if you follow the cursor, there's no valves here at the right atrium, entering the right atrium. So, blood flows into the right atrium through the vena cavas, the inferior and superior vena cavas, and the atria, the muscle around the right atrium and the left atrium at the same time contract, pushing whatever blood that's in the atrium into the ventricle through these valves. So here, through this tricuspid valve on the right side and the mitral valve on the left side, to pool into the ventricle. Then immediately there is a contraction of the ventricle to push the blood that's in the ventricle out of the pulmonary artery or the aorta through the valve, the pulmonary valve or the aortic valve. But when that happens, when the ventricle closes, the atrioventricular valve shuts to prevent blood from backflowing. Oh, one moment. Okay, so and the next thing that you need to know is how the heart controls its heartbeat in terms of myogenic muscle contractions, the role of the pacemaker nerves and medulla of the brain, and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which is actually, if any of you have allergies and ever need an EpiPen, this is the same chemical that's found in an EpiPen. So let's very quickly talk about this. So the heart is a muscle itself, and it contracts on its own. It pumps, and it actually can do that all by itself. It doesn't ever get tired. Think about this. Does your heart ever need to take a break? No, and if it did, that would be very bad for us. So it actually pumps on its own, and it contracts by itself, and that's called myogenic muscle contraction. And I'll jot that down. Oh, way over here. So there's myogenic muscle contraction. Myogenic refers to muscle and the heart, and so what we're talking about here is the heart's contractions, and it contracts by itself. But there's a pacemaker that initiates the contractions, and that exists here in the right atrium. And there's a single nerve that comes to the heart that relays messages from the brain to the heart to speed up its beating. There's a separate secondary nerve that sends another signal to the heart to slow down. And those are two ways in which the heart is controlled by the nervous system. But there's a third way, which is hormones, and that is with adrenaline. Adrenaline signals the pacemaker to increase the beating of the heart. Adrenaline is actually put into the bloodstream by the adrenal glands, which actually sit just above your kidneys in your back. And that adrenal gland puts adrenaline or epinephrine or I don't know why I'm blanking on this. Epinephrine into your bloodstream so that when they get to your heart, it speeds up your heartbeat. So think about the fight or flight kind of reaction you get when you get excited. Your heartbeat increases, not because you're exercising, but because there's some kind of stress or anxiety, and that's due to increased amounts of adrenaline. And as you know, it takes a while to get over that, and that's because there's a long-term effect, because this is a hormone that's found in your bloodstream. So if you're kind of lost about this, I'm talking about a connection between the transport system and the nervous system and hormone systems. So I want you to maybe think about that while you watch those videos. Okay? Okay, and then the next thing that we need that I'll talk about, so let me get my cursor here, is arteries, is comparing arteries, veins, and capillaries or capillaries. Okay? So let's just point out that arteries, remember the definition of arteries. I'm not going to jot this down, but make sure you know this. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood back to the heart, and the transition from an artery to a vein is the capillaries. These are thin membrane blood vessels that allow for diffusion to occur across the membrane. So let's look at this very quickly. So we're going to compare them, and so I'm going to say that arteries have a thick outer layer, and this thick outer layer prevents bulging and leaks. And whereas the veins have a thin layer, it's a thin layer. It doesn't have thick muscles around the blood vessels to push blood through. And capillaries also have thin layers. In arteries, the thick wall withstand high pressure. And remember, that pressure is coming from the ventricles that are pushing. So the pulmonary artery and the aorta are arteries that have thick walls to help protect themselves against the high pressure. The thin layer here in the veins allow veins to collapse, which sounds terrible, but it's a good thing because it allows your muscles to push the blood through. So think about what happens if you sit for a really, really long time. You might have noticed this. Your ankles get really swollen, and it's because you build up a lot of fluid in your feet. But a good way to get that fluid out is actually to get up and walk around, because your muscles are contracting and pushing on these veins that don't have a lot of structure themselves. They get pushed shut, forcing that fluid forward through the system. Okay? And these thin layers are 1 cell thick, allowing for faster transport across the membrane. Okay? And then arteries have a narrow lumen, so Lumen, which is just the space in the tube, the diameter of the space. So arteries have narrow lumens to maintain high pressure. Veins have wide lumens to maintain low blood pressure, not blood pleasure. And then the capillaries are very narrow, allowing them to get to every single cell in the body to take nutrients to them. Okay? All right, so then you need to know that blood is made out of plasma, which is the liquidy part, erythrocytes, which is another word for red blood cells, leukocytes, which is another word for white blood cells, specifically phagocytes and lymphocytes, and then lastly, that blood is made up of platelets. You also need to know that blood transports the following things: in the blood, nutrients, which got into the blood from the villi of the small intestine, oxygen, which got into the capillary bed from the alveoli within the lungs, carbon dioxide, which it takes from the cells back to the lungs to get rid of, hormones, which get put in there by the glands. The endocrine glands are in your body, like the adrenal glands, antibodies to protect your from your lymph nodes, and B cells to protect it against antigens from pathogens, urea, which is salt, nitrogenous waste, and lastly heat, which is going to be hard to remember because heat is not matter but a form of energy. Okay? And that wraps this up for the transport system.